Chapter 1. Chill. He tiptoed as quietly as he could through the hall, not intent on disturbing even the soft carpet beneath his bare feet. Blake reached the kitchen before long, still quietly creeping on the smooth linoleum. He reached the fridge and opened it. The bag lunch he'd made the night before sat on one of the shelves. He pulled it out and made his way to the nearby kitchen table where a black backpack sat. Blake unzipped a pocket and set the lunchbox inside, and then opened the larger pocket and checked the contents within. Civil War notes? Check. Health notes? Crap, I forgot to read that Mockingbird chapter. Blake shook his head. There wasn't time to worry about that. The door adjacent to the kitchen table practically screamed his name already, as did the shoes and socks sitting before him. He leaned down and put on the garments before reaching for the door and his pack. Oh crap, almost forgot. He left the door and pack, and tiptoed back again down the hall. He reached the entrance to a room at the end and on the left, and very carefully pushed open the door. Blake heard a tiny creak but ignored it and opened the door halfway. The room was dark, but the small bit of light behind him allowed a brief glimpse into the dim space. A woman lay on a bed, covered by gray bed sheets but no comforter, and she looked deep in slumber. Blake turned his attention to the nightstand beside the bed. He spotted an alarm clock, a glass half filled with water, and 2 little white pills, the latter of which Blake remembered setting there the night before. He frowned and looked back at the door, where his gaze fell downward. There was a sticky note, which he picked up and stuck back onto the door. The note read, "Don't forget your medicine this morning." He closed the door most of the way and tiptoed back down the hall. After throwing his backpack over his shoulders, he gently twisted the knob and departed. As soon as he closed the door behind him, Blake breathed in the soft morning air. Even for the early hours in May, there was a slight breeze that tickled his face, and enough sunlight to easily burn away the light fog covering the ground. Blake set his hands in his pockets and walked down the sidewalk through his front yard. "Hey, you!" Blake looked up before he heard the greeting. A girl his age, about 13 years old, stood at the end of the pathway, carrying a backpack of her own. She had dark brown hair that stretched just past her shoulders, and matching eyes that stared him down with a bright friendliness all their own. "Hey, June," he greeted in response. "You were—" The girl paused and momentarily eyed an old watch on her left wrist. 24 seconds later than me. And you're weird." June just laughed at the remark. Blake joined her, and together they made their way down the sidewalk. "You're usually out earlier than me," she mused aloud. "Everything okay?" He set a hand on the back of his head. "I sort of forgot to check Mom's meds right away. No big deal." June's wide eyes conveyed her surprise. "Whenever she doesn't feel great, that's always the first thing you check in the morning, isn't it? Maybe I should be asking how you're doing." "I haven't gotten a lot of sleep lately is all." Of course she would worry. The two of them were neighbors, close friends after all. Still, he didn't want her concerning herself too much with his well-being. "Have you tried, what's that stuff Dad mentions? Melatonin?" Blake raised an eyebrow as he stared at June. "Come again?" "It's supposed to help with sleep," she answered, still deep in thought about it. "Anyways, apparently a lot of them are gummies, and I know how much you like gummies." A smile crossed Blake's face, and he realized he could not help it. "You know me too well. Thanks, June, but I don't think it's serious enough that I should get something for it. I'd rather let Mom save up for when she needs her meds." "Then I guess I'll just have to pray for the both of you." June gave Blake a playful nudge with her shoulder, but he knew she was half serious about her own words. Prayer was a common thing amongst this community, given that the small town of Jordan Heights was a very Christian one. Blake wasn't very religious himself, and neither was his mother, but he respected the faith and beliefs of his fellow townsfolk. He so rarely talked about it with anyone. June knew of Blake's lack of beliefs, but the Joan rosary necklace she wore every day said it all about her. Either way, he liked to keep his own agnostic thoughts to himself. 2 blocks and a right turn later, Blake and June found themselves before a school. It covered an area as large as a quarter of a regular street block. A large sign on the corner of the street read, "2 weeks until summer." A myriad of students gathered at the front yard and near the entrance. Some looked to be younger than Blake and June, but many others looked much older. Jordan Heights had a small population for a town, which meant that only 1 large elementary school building was needed. Meanwhile, the remaining junior high and high school grades combined into the single facility that was Jordan Heights Secondary. Blake enjoyed some of the classes and the teachers, but the students, well, some of them were all right. "June, Blake, over here!" The voice was loud, shrill, and attracted the attention of some teens in the crowd. Blake followed June as she skipped towards the side of the crowd and approached a pair of preteens like them, a boy and a girl. The girl was the first to speak up. "So I don't know about you, but I already have tons of plans for summer vacation." "And there she goes again," said the boy. June, please talk to my sister so she doesn't overdo her planning. Again. Blake did not catch up to the duo until many seconds after June did. The girl, Amelia, was good friends with June. They'd known each other well for years. Amelia and Cameron were fraternal twins, and all four of them were the same age. This in turn made Blake and Cameron friends by default, but at least they didn't hate each other. Far from it. Come on, Cameron, you know I can't talk her out of anything when she puts her mind to something. June laughed, loud enough for him to easily hear her voice. Well, let's hear it, Blake shouted during his own approach, catching the attention of all three of them. What are your ideas so far, Amelia? The young teen raised her eyebrows, though she carried a huge smile on her face. Didn't think you heard us just then. Your voices carry, you know, he pointed. Yours in particular. Amelia stuck out her tongue, but obliged with answering the initial question. Well, we should definitely spend a weekend camping, just the four of us. We've done it enough where we should be mature and experienced enough to handle a little camping on our own. Mature and experienced. Blake slowly nodded his head, his gaze briefly flicking over the group. Sure, those are words you could use. Oh, lay off. Amelia breathed out a quick puff of air. Me and June cook. June was nodding at first, but then she quickly shook her head. Correction, I cook, you grill. You're better with that stuff. Yeah, right. Amelia agreed before continuing. So that. Then Cameron sets up camp, and Blake does everything else. All three of them stared as they attempted comprehension of Amelia's words. Blake in particular tilted his head to one side while also glancing up at the sky with thoughtfulness. Everything else? Figuring out hikes, starting campfires, organizing? Sure. Hey, that's kudos to you, said Amelia. I wish I was a better organizer, and your survival skills are nothing to sneeze at. Give yourself more credit from time to time, Cameron piped, as he wrapped his arm around Blake's neck and shoulder. Besides, Ames did just pay you a bunch of compliments. Still, Blake rolled his eyes, but in a somewhat playful manner. Well, I think it sounds fun. June clapped her hands together. But out of curiosity, Amelia, what other ideas did you have? We might have to keep our options open, just in case. You know that water park about 25 miles south? Blake and June both nodded, but it was the former that raised a question. Isn't that place a little spendy? I mean, sort of, Amelia shrugged her shoulders. But everybody's been saving money, right? We all get money from chores. Maybe we can save that for summer's end, June suggested. Which is why I suggested the lake, said Cameron. Reservoir. Okay, Miss Technical, it's pretty close, doesn't cost a thing. The south side gets really warm, but maybe we shouldn't go on the 4th of July. Blake's attention slowly drifted away, though not out of boredom. A strange sensation crept up his spine. He could feel the very hairs on his arms standing on end, despite the coverage of a long-sleeved shirt. A chill coursed through his blood, and yet at the same time the feeling was still gentle and warm. He knew the sensation all too well, though. However, he dare not mention any of this out loud. A gentle electronic bell tolled away, catching the attention of all the students outside the school. 5-minute warning, guys, said Cameron with a slight groan. He still ushered his companions with a simple wave of his hand. We'll talk summer plans later, yeah? The students began filing into the building, with the four friends near the rear of the crowd, but Blake had already slowed down, rapidly thinking. With subtlety, he reached behind his back and carefully undid one of the zippers on his backpack. As if to reposition, he leaned towards one side. A few moments later, the weight on his back lessened, and a few books and notebooks crashed on the sidewalk behind him. Blake spun around and stopped. Shoot! He glanced back at his friends. Hold on, I gotta pick up my things. I'll meet you in class. Cameron and Amelia took little notice of the incident through their own conversation, but June gave him a brief thumbs up before all three of them disappeared through the main school doors. While a few students still remained just outside the entrance, Blake now had enough room to quickly gather his things, and then creep backwards to a secluded corner of the building. He shoved his things into his backpack and scanned the grounds intently. I know you're there, he called out. You can stop hiding. But no one appeared. No one peeked out from any corners, nor did they slink out of any shadows or hiding places. Blake once again felt that unusual warm chill from earlier, much more noticeable than before. He knew he'd been right, and so his voice grew quieter. I'm not going to hurt you. They must have understood his words, because Blake suddenly looked just left, near the side of the school wall. No one stood there. No one tangible, anyway. While Blake didn't actually see anything himself, he could feel it. He never knew if it was a strange distortion, a tiny amalgamation of heat and electricity, or just something in the wind, but he sensed an invisible presence here. Based on what he felt, He could almost see the entity before him, a humanoid figure, a small male, clutching the school wall. Blake let out a sigh. "Sorry, kid. Not sure how you went, but I hope you're not in pain anymore." Just as he could not see the specter, he could also not hear a voice. Blake could, though, sense the emotions coming off the spirit in waves. Literal waves. A small tightness came over his chest as though his lungs struggled for a breath of air. The discomfort was accompanied by a sense of cold, fear, and longing. The overall impression was easy enough to dissect, and Blake closed his eyes. He focused on the residual uncertainty and fear for a few moments longer. It was an accident. They couldn't have known. Blake looked around a bit, getting a feel for the directions. Finally, he pointed northeast. "You should go that way. You'll find it before long, I promise. And I bet if you wait, you'll find your family there. You should be able to rest then." Some of the fear subsided. The uncertainty, too, had faded a little, replaced by a slight but warm feeling of trust. Blake could feel some of the relaxation emanating from the specter, and in mere moments the presence had vanished. No more weird feelings, no more strong emotions. As he rushed back into the school, Blake pondered over the conversation earlier with his friends, and what just transpired now. Maybe we ought to rethink that lake trip, he thought. I'll try to convince them. Chapter 2. Burn. Remind me next time. I owe you for those chapter notes. Yes, you do. June could not help but smile, and Blake responded with a gentle elbow to her arm. After the events of this morning, the rest of his school day had luckily been uneventful, and of course he hadn't mentioned to any of his friends the incident involving the spirit. Now it was just him and June, walking the same way they'd come from that morning. Their houses stood only a block up ahead, easy to identify even among the long stretch of homes down the street. So, I know Amelia can get a little carried away with plans, but you have to admit, planning out activities for the summer sounds really exciting. Blake nodded. And just think, we'll be in the 9th grade next year. Freshmen. I know! And then 4 years later, off to college. You know, with your grades, you could easily grab a couple of scholarships. June let out a small laugh as the both of them stopped in front of Blake's front yard. Aw, thanks. I could see you snagging a small scholarship, too. Yeah, I don't know. He shrugged his shoulders and rubbed the back of his head. Academics isn't my thing. She gave a response to his comment, but he only half paid attention. Another strange chill ran up his spine, and he fought the urge to make an irritated face. This many in less than a day? His mind screamed. One last night, and another the afternoon before. This is starting to happen more often than normal. So, you won't, right? Blake returned to reality and realized he had no idea what June had just told him. But given her slightly furrowed brows, he could only make an educated guess about the context of her inquiry. No, I won't. Promise. Unfortunately, June did not look entirely convinced, but Blake gave her a quick wave before he walked down the path leading to his house. See you tomorrow, June. He pulled out his keys from the side pocket of his backpack and stuck them in the door. As he unlocked it, he looked left and saw June at the next house over. He then watched her disappear into her home after a quick wave in his direction. Blake's key jangled when he turned them and finally entered his home. He set his backpack on a kitchen chair nearest the door and stretched his arms up, but he did not relax for long. The chill up his spine reminded him that he still had another order of business to attend to. He slowly walked down the hall, looking left and right and waiting, trying to get a sense of things. He waited a few moments longer before his gaze made its way to the other side of the house and the door to the backyard. Blake's eyes narrowed a little as he entered a small office, complete with a couple of chairs and small desks, a single computer sitting atop one of the desks. Directly in front of him stood a door with a light blue curtain that covered the window on the upper half of the entryway. It was locked. Blake unlocked it and opened it halfway. The backyard was a simple one, with grass and dirt patches, surrounded on 3 sides by a tall wooden fence that stood taller than him. Blake performed a quick scan of the yard, but did not initially notice anything unusual. Even so, Blake could sense something here. Another specter, but different from the one this morning, and he was certain an entity stood in the middle of the yard. It took a few moments for the specter to take notice of his presence. Blake narrowed his eyes and concentrated hard. An adult. Female. And an individual that felt lost, just like the little boy. Yet at the same time, this spirit emanated waves of calm. Do you need help? He asked. The entity seemed accepting of his offer, but Blake couldn't really feel anything else. He stepped out further into the backyard, but left the door behind him open. I need a bit more to go on, he said. Where are you from? A moment later, an image of mountains flickered in his mind, and for a few seconds the hairs on his arms, legs, and neck stood on end. Mountains? Like the Rockies? The specter did not respond. Blake thought harder. What about the Appalachians? A sense of familiarity rushed over him. Blake was surprised for a moment, but he shook his head. You're a long way from home then, he said. This is western Utah, practically the other side of the country. You want to go east. Far east. It seemed that the figure understood. However, she did not move. Blake waited a few moments longer, but still nothing happened. Is something wrong? For a second he caught a whiff of something. Burning wood, but the scent was not a malicious one. It was calm and warm. He also smelled pine and shrubs. He sensed strength and energy emanating from her, and though he needed a few moments, he eventually understood. You were camping, right? In a forest east of here. There was some kind of accident? It was as if the specter nodded. Blake focused for more details, but found none. Whatever had caused their demise, it had come too quick for her to realize. He focused even harder on the direction. I don't know for sure, but head east, he suggested. If you were with someone, chances are good they're in that direction. Surely the partial closure would have sufficed for this woman, but to Blake's stunned confusion, they still remained. He squinted his eyes. What is it? The specter emanated a new emotion, one he did not expect. Fear. But this was not fear associated with death. This woman feared something in their current state. They feared another presence? Blake had not felt anything like this before, but perhaps he'd missed a sign of some sort. He looked around, and let his perception reach out further. He waited for the familiar sensation of a warm chill down his back. But what struck him was something else entirely. He held his breath as a burn pulsated throughout his body. It radiated primarily in his arms and legs, and while the feeling seemed accompanied by a slight stinging sensation, something else alarmed him more. His chest was reacting to it. Why did his heart race in such a rapid and unpleasant manner? He then noticed it. His fingertips quivered. Blake looked around with a start, but had no idea why his own body seemed afraid right now. He'd never experienced this kind of sensation before. Suddenly his gaze froze, fixated. He noticed movement, near the corner of a fence, a shadowy figure. Even with a step forward and squinted eyes, he could not completely make it out. The wispy shadow twitched, then disappeared behind the fence. Blake was still as a statue for what felt like a season. The strange burn ebbed away, but it did not completely take away the apprehension. Something was wrong. He'd been able to sense the presence of spirits since before he could remember. He could feel certain things, certain images, smells, and emotions, and even then he only made guesses on who they were and what they looked like. But he had never seen anything like that shadow before. Not only that, but he felt like he had actually seen it just then. He swallowed nervously. A chill ran back up his spine, and he remembered the woman again. They still stood in place, but whether or not they noticed what Blake did, he could not tell. He breathed calmly and cleared his throat. Do you, think you can head east now? The specters seemed much more confident in themselves, and Blake breathed a sigh of relief. A wave of gratitude washed over him in moments. The spirit then left, and the chill was once again gone. But Blake was not done. He ran across his backyard, reaching the corner where that shadow had seemingly appeared. The splintered wood at the top prevented him from climbing up too much, though he managed a small look over the fence, enough to see other backyards and little groves of trees. Nothing. Whatever materialized had long since vanished. Not to mention that strange burn no longer coursed through his veins. With a heavy sigh, he lowered himself from the fence and rubbed off any wood shavings still stuck on his hands. Okay, he muttered, walking back up to the open back door of his house. Try not to freak out. It had to have been your mind playing a trick on you. Yet even he knew how foolish that sounded aloud. His body clearly reacted to the shadow entity, whatever it was, and not in a very pleasant manner. His spirit-sensing ability had been with him a long time. In the past, he'd maybe sense a specter and make contact with it every 9 days or so. But in the last week, he would sense many spirits in a single day, and make contact with at least one of them in that same time period. So maybe, just maybe, his ability was strengthening, so much so that he was seeing more than just harmless spirits. And these new creatures could see him, too. Blake slapped his cheeks with both hands before he closed the door behind him. Stop thinking like that, he told himself. Still, he leaned against the door and groaned with unease. If this got worse, he worried it would affect his everyday life. Click, click. His heart stopped, and his legs tensed as he spun around. That was the front door. Was someone trying to break in? Instinctively, Blake hid behind the wall, with only the hall and the kitchen standing between him and the door. It finally stopped. Blake, you home? He exhaled when he recognized the voice, and he pressed his back against the wall for a few seconds. But then he stepped out into the open of the hallway and gave a small wave. "You startled me," he said. "I didn't expect you to be home so early." The woman before him wasn't quite 40, but most wouldn't have guessed it based on her fair-skinned face, with a slight sheen on her shoulder-length blonde hair that showed no signs of aging or grayness. Even so, there were noticeable bags under Alicia's eyes, and her lips looked a bit dry. Not only that, her cheekbones did not appear to be quite full, as his were. "Sorry, I needed to take care of some things." She walked through the hallway, past Blake and towards the office, specifically towards the printer on the end of the desk. He then noticed the small set of folders that she clutched. "Some things to take care of?" he echoed. She unlocked the computer and opened up a folder. "The printer jammed up again at the pharmacy. Deborah doesn't think we'll get repairs until tomorrow morning, so I offered to print out some forms and documents we still need for tonight." Blake could not help but smile. "You're too kind, Mom." Alicia focused on the computer, but Blake noticed a tiny smile creep onto her face. When he noticed her yawn, and then cough right afterward, he frowned. He paused before speaking. "You took a pill this morning, right?" "I did, thank you." "You forgot your medication last night, though." Her fingers stopped moving on the keyboard, and she briefly cast a side glance in his direction. Her lips tightened, her indication of embarrassment. Blake simply raised an eyebrow in her direction. "Mom, you know you need your meds when you get these colds. I don't want you feeling miserable. You already don't sleep well, and you get nasty headaches when you don't have a cold to worry about." It wasn't exactly a medical condition, but Alicia's immune system wasn't exactly the strongest. She was often not well, but did her best, and she was more prone to even little things like colds, so when she got one, Blake always made sure they had plenty of medications on hand so she was as comfortable as possible. "I know, and I'm sorry. Sometimes I just get so tired that I don't think about it. I promise I'll take it tonight." In a brief moment she pulled him into an embrace, with his face leaned into her warm chest. "I'm sorry you have to take care of me sometimes. I mean, I should be the one taking care of you, right?" Then she stepped back and returned to the computer. Alicia sounded genuine and remorseful, and Blake thought it lucky that her forgetfulness was seldom seen. He also considered himself lucky that his own immune system was very strong. Even with his mother's genetics and frequently being around her, he'd not gotten sick once in his life. Perhaps his strength came from his... Blake shook his head, not about to finish the thought. But for some reason, the memory of that strange shadow crossed his mind. He about opened his mouth and said something, but he held his tongue. "No," he scolded inwardly. "Mom doesn't need to know about any of that, remember?" Instead, he focused on the current conversation. "It happens sometimes," he finally said. "But just remember tonight, okay?" "I will." She looked at him with a smile and a twinkle in her eye, then returned to her work on the computer. Blake stood and stared for a moment longer, but eventually he left the office and headed for his room. He paused at the doorway, groaning to himself, but he entered anyway. Chapter 3. Blaze. "Dalton, those are not push-ups. Cameron, you're next on the rope." Blake's friend approached the thick twine hanging from the low gym ceiling, and opened his hand to grab it, but did not yet begin the climb. "Been practicing all semester," said Cameron with a grin. "I'll definitely beat my record this time." "You've been saying that for the last 2 weeks, grumbled a nearby Amelia, who gasped a little for air. Movement in the corner of his eye caught Blake's attention immediately afterward. A number of students, with June among them, ran around the perimeter of the gym over and over again. Amelia, Cameron, and a few others stood near the rope, breathless. Blake, however, was not. A couple of seconds later, June approached the group at the rope, heaving for air. She still carried a smile on her face. "I'd like to hear you say you'll beat Blake's record." Cameron simply glared at her, but then put his focus back on the rope. A few feet away, the gym teacher held a stopwatch. "Go!" He climbed the rope by pulling up with his arms, and with his feet he grabbed and pushed downward. Blake raised his eyebrows, surprised by the speed at which the teen ascended. His gaze rose above his friend. At the top of the rope, at the low-rise rafters, was a bell. Cameron smacked it as he reached the top. 18.34 seconds, the teacher shouted. With one hand's hold on the rafters, Cameron puffed his open fist into the air. "Yes! Record beat!" "By just over 0.4 seconds, said the teacher after a quick look at her clipboard. "Nice job. Come on down." While Cameron slid down the rope in careful and short bursts, Blake's mind wandered. Over the course of the school day, he'd thought about today's morning. During his and June's walk to school, he had sensed 2 more specters, and a possible third. He even thought he'd caught sight of a shadow creature again, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. The increasing frequency of these occurrences was already an unsettling concern. "Blake!" Despite the loud shout, he did not jump, though he realized the teacher must have called his name a few times already. "Sorry," he apologized. "I spaced out." "Well, now your attention needs to come back to class," said the teacher. "You're up on the rope." Blake inhaled and stepped up onto the mat beneath the rope. He reached out a little for the rope, but did not grab it just yet. He waited. "Go!" He grabbed the rope with one hand and began to climb. But unlike Cameron's methods, Blake did not use his legs at all. He used only the sheer strength in his arms to pull himself, with ease, right to the top of the rafters. He smacked the bell once he reached the top. 11.97 seconds! The teacher sounded mildly impressed, but Blake knew he hadn't beaten his record. He barely loosened his grip on the rope and grabbed it again quickly to prevent an accelerated descent. He repeated the process a few more times. At about a third of the distance to go, Blake released the cord entirely and dropped. He landed on the mat with a loud thud, his knees having braced while part of the impact. But then he brushed off his pants with a short swipe. Nearby, Cameron snorted. "Show off." Blake shrugged, but could not help adding in a little smile as well. He then approached June, Amelia, and another girl beside them.
"Seriously, how do you do that?"
Amelia shook her head, though her eyes were wide with awe. "You don't look muscled enough for that kind of nonsense." "No idea," he simply replied.
"Those kinds of things just come naturally to him,"
said June as she stepped forward a little.
"Athleticism can be a talent."
Blake shrugged again, not knowing. It didn't matter if it was dodgeball or soccer, testing his endurance or strength or speed. He was considered to be an asset in any team activity, and he often excelled at any physical task. "Dan, you're up," the teacher called out. "Those that are finished, you can get changed. Those that are still running, hurry it up. You all got lunch next, which I'm sure you don't want to miss." Blake, Cameron, and a few other boys went to the locker room, changing out of the ragged shirts and shorts back into regular clothes. As Blake pulled his own shirt over his head, a sensation ran up his spine, an unsettling burn. Out of sight of the others, Blake looked around with narrowed eyes. There was a burn, all right, but a slight one. Did that mean what he thought it meant? "Hey, Blake!" He turned his head right as Cameron leaned over and waved at him. "Lunchtime. You coming?" Blake nodded, and after, he grabbed his things with Cameron out of the locker room. The path from the gym to the cafeteria was a short one. There were many long tables, but only half were filled with students, most of them middle schoolers like him. Then there was the cafeteria line with about a dozen students lined up, and he spotted June and Amelia in that line. Cameron joined them, but Blake took a seat at an open end of one of the tables before pulling out his lunchbox from his backpack. He opened it up. There was a half sandwich, an apple, and some broccoli. Small, but easy. It wasn't long before his friends joined him. "Only you would bring vegetables for lunch," sighed and exasperated Amelia. "I'm not picky," said Blake.
"At least he eats healthy,"
June laughed. "Unlike someone I know." It wasn't clear if she addressed Cameron or Amelia, but they both clearly took some mild offense to that.
"Change the subject, please."
Amelia stretched her arms up for a moment.
"Summer plans? Anyone? We got 2 weeks."
"How often do we need to talk about this?" said June.
"Until we've got a solid plan." "Solid plan? For 3 whole months? We got a lot of time. Now what about that trip to the lake?"
Once again, Blake zoned out, but he wasn't bored. He just had an uneasy feeling. He thought that burning sensation had returned, but his senses felt so overloaded with smells and noises right now that he wasn't entirely sure. Everyone in the lunchroom had already grabbed their food and sat down. Some students headed outside through the cafeteria door for some sun. Others ate and cackled. His own friends talked plans, but he only half listened to their words. Blake took a bite of his apple as he watched the cafeteria staff clean up the kitchen. He stopped himself from taking a second bite. There, in the kitchen, it was a wisp of some kind, a tiny shadow floating around the room in there. Blake knew he saw it, and he squinted his eyes for a brief moment. Shadowy wisp fluttered about, mostly hanging around the 3 staff back there, and for a moment he thought he locked gazes with it. "Are you even listening?" As if broken from a trance, Blake blinked and looked at his friends. June in particular had quite the quizzical expression on her face, with very furrowed brows and curled lips. Cameron looked a bit confused also, though Amelia just rolled her eyes. "No, sorry, I zoned out." "You've been zoning out a lot today." More than anything, June sounded concerned. "Are you sure you've been feeling all right lately? Maybe someone needs better sleep?" Blake gave her a curt nod, then a shake of his head. He suddenly realized he just confused himself. "Yeah, no, I'm all good. Just, thinking about school ending. And summer."
"Oh, really?"
said Amelia.
Well, if you're thinking so hard on it, why not share your thoughts?
Of course. Now he had to come up with a good excuse for his daydreaming. But what could he mention? The lake, he blurted. The idea is nothing new, said Cameron, but if you'd like to add something, we should maybe rethink going there at all. Cameron and June exchanged a confused glance for a good few seconds.
Really?
Then piped Amelia as she stared at him with narrowed eyes.
Why do you say that?
Because... He swallowed, unable to come up with an explanation. He rested his hand on the back of his neck, and not a moment later the burning sensation returned. He couldn't focus on the conversation, especially now that his spine almost stung. There was definitely something nearby, but did he try to figure out why or distract the others with a response?
Hey, put that out, now!
The shouting of some adults caught the attention of most students in the cafeteria. Neither Blake nor his friends knew what was going on, but then Blake noticed a little flare go off in the kitchen, and then another.
Put that out!
Blake suddenly watched a huge flame burst from one of the appliances. The staff yelped, and a large crowd of students had noticed. Once they caught sight of the fire, they chattered with fear. It remained in place. The fire alarm sounded off moments later.
Shoot, we gotta go!
His friends did not hesitate to stand and head straight for the exit like everyone else. Blake reached for his backpack first, even though he knew he shouldn't, and prepared to follow his friends. A wave of nausea hit him suddenly, and his vision felt fuzzy. His head began to throb terribly, and he grabbed his hair with a groan, unable to stand for a moment.
Blake!
June was at his side in seconds, and helped him stand on his feet.
Blake, are you okay?
Yeah, he grumbled.
I just... Save it, you're not, come on!
Her decisive and commanding tone convinced Blake not to argue or talk with her any further. He just let her lead him out of the cafeteria. But he cast one last glance back at the kitchen. He ignored the presence of the remaining students in the room, and instead set all focus on the flames in the back. They grew, slowly, but something else caught his eye. A little shadow, and a second one. Both made eye contact with him, and for another moment his head throbbed. They looked at one another, and then both bounded towards another kitchen appliance. It was as if they disappeared into the mechanism. Moments later, a flame burst from that appliance, which increased the size and strength of the fire surrounding it. Blake's eyes widened, but he said nothing as June carried him outside. They walked and joined the rest of the students. The entire way, Blake's head pounded, making him both dizzy and unbalanced. Though the further away he walked from the school, the less it hurt. But it did not vanish entirely. He still needed a moment, and so sat down the first chance he got. June stood by him the entire time and eventually rested her hand on his shoulder. Cameron and Amelia joined them before long. "Oh crap, what happened?" asked the former. "Are you hurt?" One of the teachers approached the group just as Blake responded with a shake of his head. No, I just got dizzy for a moment. Came out of nowhere. But it's already going away." After the teacher ensured he had no injuries, Blake looked up and around at his friends. Every one of them had crinkled mouths and furrowed brows that conveyed their worry. "Couldn't have been the fire," said Cameron. "Did you get the headache before it started?" Blake shook his head. No, it started after."
Doesn't it seem weird, though?
June's question confused everyone, so she explained further.
I mean, you never get headaches. It's not that weird, Amelia said. He probably gets them, but just doesn't say anything because he's stubborn like that. He's alright now, yeah? So what does it matter?
I don't know. It was a strange situation. Both Amelia and June were right. He didn't often let others know if he was having problems. But he also knew he'd never really had a headache before, at least nothing that would give him this much vertigo. And he had the sneaking suspicion that those shadowy creatures had something to do with it. But knowing he could not explain this to his friends, he simply groaned. Trying to make sense of all this is almost giving me another headache. He saw that Amelia turned her head, and without warning she ran off into the crowd of students. Blake and the others exchanged glances and shrugged their shoulders. He looked around at the other students and listened to their conversations. Most of them chatted about the fire, the cafeteria, and classes, but he heard no mention of any monsters or shadowy creatures. No one had seen anything, at least not anything unusual. Those things must be like the spirits I talked to, he thought. But they're not the same. They don't give me the same feeling. So then what are they?
Hey guys!
He must have been lost in thought for a little while, because Amelia was already jogging back towards them.
The fire department should be here soon, she informed. The faculty says we should probably call our parents or just head on home. They don't think we should come in tomorrow while they do repairs and stuff, so...
Does that mean we get a 3-day weekend? Cameron perked up before he even asked that.
Guess so.
Sweet! A teacher neared them and many other students before long, and relayed to all of them the same information that Amelia already had. The students seemed content with the news, and many of them ready for departure from school grounds. Some didn't have any bags with them, but few looked worried about that. Blake looked over at June. "Can I borrow your phone?"
"Sure."
She handed her device, a little flip phone, into Blake's reach. He accepted it with gratitude and opened up the phone, dialed a number, and let it ring. And ring. And ring. No answer, but there was a ringtone at the end. "Hey, Mom, so there was a fire at school. But I'm fine. Everyone is. No one got hurt. But school got shut down, probably for tomorrow too. Anyways, I'm heading home early, so I thought I'd let you know. Love you, and see you later. Bye." With that, he hung up, and then he handed the phone back to June with a soft thanks as he did so.
"Cam and I need to wait for Dad," said Amelia. "We'll be about 20 minutes, though."
"Too bad we're not within walking distance like you two." Cameron indicated Blake and June with his pointer finger.
"I can wait with you to keep you company," June offered. "Aw, thanks."
Amelia gave her friend a quick hug.
"Thank goodness for best friends, because I can't always stand a certain brother."
She shot Cameron a squinty-eyed look, but he simply rolled his eyes in response. Blake already had different plans. After a few more moments of rest, he reached for his backpack and stood, albeit carefully.
"Are you going home already?" asked a concerned June. "What about your head?"
"My head's doing better, so I'll be fine," he said. "Home's not that far away, and I could really use some water." June tilted her head to one side, and Blake responded by setting a hand on her shoulder. "I'll be fine," he told her with the most matter-of-fact tone he could give her. She looked convinced enough, and nodded to him. Blake waved to his friends and then set off for home. His pace was a tad slower than usual as he walked, then turned toward his house. But as soon as he was out of sight of the school, he stopped, then reached for his head as the slight throbbing sensation returned. But with no hesitation, he jumped forward in a burst of speed and ran straight home. Chapter 4. Box. Blake unlocked the front door in a quick and frantic manner, and then slammed it shut behind him. He couldn't tell how fast he gasped for air, but he couldn't stop or slow it down. He dropped his backpack at the door, but walked no further. His eyes scanned left and right. Something's wrong. Very wrong, he thought. Those shadows, they were at school. They started the fire. I saw it. How was it even possible? Not only that, the strange burning sensation, he felt it. Here, at home. Why were they here too, and how? Blake slapped his cheeks with his palms. "Get a hold of yourself!" And immediately he tiptoed through the living room and kitchen and down the hallway. Would he find those creatures? Because something told him they were near, but he had no clue if and where they might show up. He drew closer towards the bedrooms. His room was on one side. His mother's room was just beyond that, on the other side of the hallway. He stepped towards the slightly ajar doorway. A searing pain assaulted his head with no warning, causing him to drop to his knees. He grabbed his hair, but the torment did not ebb. Where had this come from? It was like a barrage of voices screaming inside his head all at once, coupled with a twisted, burning sensation that coursed up and down his spine throughout his head. It was so overwhelming he thought he might pass out. No, stop it! But for some reason, a little of the pain went away, but not all of it. He could finally look around now, though. Still, nothing seemed unusual. Blake looked back towards his mother's room. He did not know why, but something drew him in. As if on instinct, he stood and slowly walked in there. There were no windows in this room. As a matter of fact, there wasn't much of anything in here. Bed, nightstand, large shelf, lamp, and a closet. Blake's mother had never been one for material possessions. So what pressured him to even come in here? His head throbbed once more and he nearly fell to his knees, but he managed to hold his composure and balance. The room had already become blurry, and with the room so dark he couldn't clearly see his surroundings. He looked around, then stopped almost immediately. Something had come into focus. No, that wasn't it. More like something in his vision was pulsating the longer he looked at it. Blake closed his eyes and shook his head. Once his thoughts had cleared up a bit, he reopened his eyes and found himself looking at the wall closet. With a raised eyebrow he stared. Why would he be looking at that of all things? He reached out but hesitated. He'd never seen his mother's belongings before, and the idea of snooping through her things did not sit well with him. The burn ran up his spine again, stronger than before. He felt he now had no choice but to open the closet door. Clothes. Most were hanging, others were folded in messy bunches amongst the little shelves stuffed in the closet. Other than a few random items here and there, Blake saw nothing unusual in here. Take it. Blake shook his head fiercely. Where did that thought come from? And what did it mean? His vision went fuzzy again. and again he thought he saw a pulsating image. What was it exactly? With a few flutters of his eyelids, he realized that whatever he saw, it lay in the corner of the closet, and it was large. He decided to go in blind and reached it, behind the closed-in shelves. He fumbled and groaned, but could not feel anything. The burn in his body became so strong that his muscles felt hot and uncomfortable in pain. He spun around. A screech filled his ears with high-pitched agony as an outline of something crawled toward him. A shadow creature. Blake jumped and banged his head against one of the shelves. He was dizzy, but not defeated. "Get out!" The thing was in his mother's room, which was a surprise. The creature leapt right for him without warning, but as if on instinct, Blake kicked at it. To his shock, the attack connected, and the shadow crashed against the wall with a loud shriek. Blake felt his heart racing. What was going on? What was that thing? Why did it attack him? And why could he touch it? Take it. He froze. That thought again. Only it was not his own voice. Instinctively he spun around. The image, it was still blurry, but there. The dark creature struggled to stand, and so Blake once again reached for the corner of the closet. He reached behind the shelf, feeling around for something. The creature screeched as if to prepare for another attack. Blake stretched further, groaning, hoping to feel something solid. The creature bounced around a few times before its final lunge, but just as it did, Blake pulled at the object and swung it, hitting the shadow away into the hallway. He quickly stood and slammed the door shut, gasping for a breath. And then he at last looked at what he held in his hand, and stared. It was a long box, a simple one with 3 metal clips. Blake set it down, not having a clue as to why he was so drawn to this. Thud! Was the creature trying to break in? Blake set the box down and undid one clip, and then the second. The third, slightly rusted over, took a bit more effort. He heard another thud on the door as he unlocked the final clasp. There was another thud, and he finally opened the lid of the long case, and he couldn't believe his eyes. It was a staff. A simple black staff, and yet he found himself strangely drawn to it. He did not know exactly what it was, or even why his mother had it, but it must have meant something to her. Blake reached forward and opened his hand to grab one end of the staff. As soon as he touched the staff, his entire body froze. He grabbed his chest with his other hand, panicking. Had his heart just stopped? He could feel the heat coming off his body like a faint steam, yet his appendages were so cold he felt completely frozen. No matter how hard he tried, he could not let go of the staff. The crushing weight in his chest was now agonizing, and his head again throbbed with sharp pain as though someone stabbed a spear right into his skull. He gasped for air and was utterly terrified, and still he could not release the staff from his grip. For some reason, his arm pulled the object up and out of the box. Crack! Blake spun around. The shadow had forced the door open, and now stood just inside the doorway. But something was different. Before, the creature had been nothing more than a 4-legged and blurry wisp of shadow and mist, but now its form was tangible and clear. Its shape was reminiscent of a dog, with gangly legs and a thin body, while it possessed no muzzle, clearly snarled, and the only non-blackened part of its body were the eyes. They were a faded silver. But the shadow creature was angry and stalked right towards him. The shadow's presence had surprised and even frightened him at first, yet at this moment he felt a new strength coursing through him. It was as if all the fear had been expelled from his mind. Without hesitation, and without feeling the slightest bit of pain, Blake stood up, holding one end of the staff. As he spun around and reached with his other hand, he grabbed the opposite end of the staff. He widened his stance, prepared for either an offensive or defensive tactic. For some reason, the creature stopped, and then it backed away. Something happened with the staff. A black wisp emanated from it, and shrouded the black rod in a translucent cloak of darkened shadow. And suddenly his gaze rose up to eye the staff's end. A massive black blade was fastened near the tip, curved and draped in shadow. Blake could not believe his eyes. Not a staff, but a scythe? Click, click. The strange sound drew Blake's attention back in the direction of the door. He could not believe his eyes as soon as his gaze fell upon the shadowy creature. He should be afraid. He knew he should be. This was very clearly a dark creature, more malevolent than the ghostly spirits he would often encounter. What was he even supposed to do? His lack of focus prevented him from noticing the shadow leap into the air right for him. It was all Blake could do to hold the staff in front of him, and get forced onto his back once the creature made contact. Blake held up the staff with as much strength as he could muster while the shadow snarled and chomped for his face. This weapon, was it a heavy burden, or was he just imagining it? His mind couldn't concentrate on any single thing. It merely struggled to survive by telling the rest of his body to keep this creature at bay. With little thought, Blake suddenly kicked up at the creature. It wasn't strong enough to push off the dark entity, but enough to throw it off balance. Blake then thrust one side of the scythe into the creature, what one would hardly consider an attack. But now he could stand, back away with his hands clutching the weapon even tighter. The shadow emitted a series of clicks and growls as though it prepared another pounce. A tightness overwhelmed his chest. He had no idea what to do. Destroy it. That voice, something about it felt almost familiar. For some reason, his grip on the scythe lessened. No longer did they feel tight with tension, but rather clutched the staff with a sort of inner strength welling up inside of him. The room did not appear as dark as it had moments ago, and a feeling of ease overtook him for but a moment. The creature no longer readied itself for an attack, but merely stared at Blake for what felt like a season. Go. As if on instinct, a pair of feet pushed off the ground, propelling him forward with intense speed. He clutched the scythe tightly and watched the creature back up with a startled click. But it was too late. It could not even turn around completely as the curved blade swung about in the blink of an eye. The shadow screeched as its physical form was severed completely in half. Its silver eyes glowed wide before it disintegrated in the air like ash in the sun, and the unusual burning sensation from earlier had all but disappeared. Blake finally blinked his eyes, and his mind cleared enough to let him know that he had no idea what had just happened. He stood up straight and looked around, his brows becoming furrowed. He felt lightheaded, as though he'd just been in some kind of trance, and yet he was acutely aware of what had just happened. The creature he'd just seen. It looked different from before. At first, he'd seen a wisp of darkness with two barely distinguishable eyes the color of a faded silver, but now the shape almost looked more tangible, having taken the form of a dog-like creature. It bore a mouth almost like a muzzle, with what looked like tiny teeth in its slightly gaped jaw. Even the sound of it a bit different. He'd heard something akin to a chicken growl, mixed with a strange noise of what sounded like a trickling stream of water from an old videotape. The little puffs of shadow particles surrounding the creatures waved, almost like a dance, but that which clearly still emitted a sense of malice. And him. He'd started out frightened and panicked, but then he just jumped right for the creature without a second thought and slashed it in two. Blake stared down at the scythe he clutched, his gaze slowly moving over its sleek and curved blade. He released his grip on it without a second thought. It landed on the carpeted floor with a very soft thud. Blake couldn't move, and he couldn't look away either. He just stared. Honk. Was that a car horn? Blake spun around and his heart picked up pace. He ran out towards the hallway without a second thought and headed straight for the front door, stumbling a few times in the process. He skidded to a halt, but did not reach for the doorknob. Instead, he leaned towards a small window at the upper section of the door and took a careful peek. There was no car in the small driveway. Blake repositioned. A neighbor, opposite of June's house, popped out of his vehicle and walked down the sidewalk to their own front door. He breathed a heavy sigh of relief, and as soon as he backed away, his knees crumpled beneath him. The world seemed blurry for a moment, and no matter how often he attempted to replay the event, he just could not. Blake soon realized just how labored and uneven his breathing was, so he put a hand on his chest in an effort to calm himself down, and to stop the very slight shaking of his hands. Whatever had just happened in his mother's room, he had no idea how to process it all. Wait! Her room! Though his legs felt weak, Blake jumped onto his feet and raced down the hallway, screeching to a halt before the open doorway with wide eyes. The scythe was gone, and so was the box he'd pulled it from. Chapter 5. Faint. He sat on the couch and stared at the carpet. Some light shone in through the living room windows, but within the hour that light faded. Blake tapped his fingers on his legs over and over while his jaw shifted back and forth. Confused thoughts swirled about in his mind the entire time. She has to know, right? I mean, it was in her room. He checked 3 separate times within the last few hours, but still he could not find the scythe in her room. It was as if it just vanished of its own will. Well, if an inanimate object could have a will at all. He'd even considered the possibility that maybe it somehow returned to the chest, but that had disappeared without a trace as well. Blake stood up with a start. He wanted to check once more. He made his way down the hall and peeked into Alicia's room yet again. Still, a dim light remained in there, and besides the furniture, the floors were bare. He stepped inside and checked the closet again, pushing aside some things and squinting his eyes. No, still not there. With a dissatisfied grunt, Blake left his mother's room and set his hands on the back of his neck. When he returned to the living room, he did not sit down again. He instead paced, and shook his head a few times while doing so. The scene from earlier replayed in his mind over and over again. The scythe, the clear image of the shadowy creature, what he did. One of his hands ended up on his forehead as he realized what he'd done. He just sliced it in two. Killed it, most likely. Sure, he'd initially struggled to fight back, but something had suddenly pushed him forward to sever that creature in half without the slightest hesitation. He just didn't know why. "Come on, pull yourself together," he scolded inwardly. "Freaking out like this is not going to help." A sudden chill ran up his spine, a warm chill that stayed with him for many seconds. Blake slowly turned around, blinked, and then frowned. "Oh, you must be joking." Whatever it was came from the backyard. Much as he didn't want to, Blake headed for the back door and unlocked it. He breathed in before he opened the door and leaned out. He did not immediately notice anything strange, but his senses told him to look right, and once he did, he could not believe his eyes. A specter stood near the side of his house. But this was different. He actually felt like he could physically see the ghostly figure before him. Not only that, but the image was a much clearer one than anything he'd ever seen. He was a young man, maybe in his late teens or early 20s, with dark and clean hair. However, the rest of his body did not appear so immaculate. It seemed dirty, and there looked to be some blood as well. Blake only required a second to look at the specter over. "What happened to you?" Before he could even finish, a sudden force slammed into his chest, carrying nothing but a horrific pain, and he thought his lungs would pop right then and there. A second later, he felt nothing. Absolutely nothing. Blake had felt this before and knew what it meant, though he'd never experienced that sensation to this extreme, and it took all his composure to remain standing. "That really hurt, you know," he told the specter in as calm a voice as he could manage. "Was it close to here?" He actually watched the spirit nod its head, something he'd never seen so clearly before. Blake shook his head and kept his focus, looking around. "Where did you come from?" Blake faced the spirit with a sudden jolt, realizing it spoke to him. Or more like words popped into his head rather than images or emotions. It was such a jarring and unfamiliar experience, so much so that he could only make out a few of the words that washed over him. Highway, tired, wheel. He thought on it a moment, then said, "You fell asleep at the wheel?" Only then did the emotion kick in. Waves of exhaustion hit him like a powerful gust of wind, followed by waves of guilt and fear. The final moments. Blake was all too familiar with the string of residual emotions. "The nearest highway is that direction." He then pointed south. "Try starting there." Unable to do anything else, Blake turned around and opened the back door to his house, but he stopped himself. A brief glance told him that the spirit still stood there, and had not moved even an inch. He faced the spirit again, and again pointed southward. "The highway is that way," he repeated. "You understand, right?" It did not nod or shake its head, but there was also no indication that the specter was confused by his words. Instead, though, it took a step towards him. "Hey, I don't know why you're coming to me," said Blake, taking a step back. "I can't help you any more than that." But it would not listen. It took a few more steps in his direction. Another wave emitted from the specter. It was faint, and Blake didn't recognize it at first, but it took him a few moments to identify the emotion, a sense of calming relief. But why? The sound of car tires squeaking into a driveway shifted his attention. It sounded close. Blake held out open palms before the spirit. "Just wait here. I'll figure something out, I guess." Even to himself, the uncertainty in his voice was painfully obvious. Yet the spirit seemed quite understanding and remained in place. He didn't have much of a choice, so Blake re-entered his house and walked down the hall to the front door. He opened it and looked out towards the car on the driveway and immediately observed his mother's car. But she had not been the one driving it. Blake watched in confusion as a woman helped Alicia out of the passenger seat of her own car and half carry her up to the house. Blake hurried forward and met them about halfway down the sidewalk. His mother looked terrible, her face pale and a hand clutching her head fiercely. "Mom." Blake did not raise his voice, but he did not mean to sharpen his tone. "What happened? Are you okay?" "Sorry about this, Blake," said the woman helping Alicia. She sounded genuinely concerned with her deep but calm voice. "We would have tried calling you, but your mother's got the only phone in the house. She fainted." Blake breathed out and tried not to let his words waver. "Again?" The woman nodded. "It was strange this time. Dab." It was Alicia who interrupted all of a sudden. She raised her chin, looked at her friend, but her head was clearly not stable. "It's all right, I'm fine." "You're decidedly not fine." With Blake's assistance, the woman helped Alicia into the house and set her gently on the couch.
You weren't tired enough today for a fainting spell. You'd eaten an hour beforehand.
So what went wrong? Asked Blake.
That's just it. Nothing.
The woman stepped aside so Blake could sit beside his mother.
I've watched her fainting spells before, but this one happened out of nowhere.
As he rubbed his mother's back, he pressed the woman for more information. When did it happen?
A few hours ago, she replied. I brought her to the hospital and they gave her some fluids. They thought it might have been dehydration. Anyway, they wanted her to stay home and rest for now. So don't come in tomorrow, Alicia.
Easy enough. Blake nodded to the woman, feeling very grateful towards her. Thanks, Dr. Reynolds. I'll keep an eye on her tomorrow.
The woman clearly could not hold back a smile. You don't have to. But thank you for looking after your mother, Blake. And my recommendation? She ought to see the doctor again, maybe switch up her medication. The idea didn't appeal to him, but if the doc was suggesting it, then he supposed he should at least think about it. He gave her a curt nod in response. Blake, honey.
Alicia trailed off for a moment, but she now had both his and Dr. Reynolds' attention.
You can't stay home from school tomorrow, not for my sake.
She sounded so tired and uncomfortable, like she didn't want to move or speak anymore, but it was something of strange relief for him. At least she's alert enough to know what day it is, he thought. No worries, Mom, he assured. Long story, but there was a little fire in the school kitchen earlier. Alicia jolted her head to face Blake, and he quickly explained. But no one got hurt, don't worry. The school's just gonna get closed tomorrow for repairs, so I'll be home anyway. She looked a bit relieved by his words. With that, Blake stood up and faced Dr. Reynolds, his hands clasped together as he dipped his head to her with gratitude. Thanks again for today.
Not a problem. She once again gave him a little smile. You both take care.
Blake showed her out the door, then locked him once the doctor had left. He let out a quiet sigh, and then turned to his mother. She still clutched her head with her hand, but her lips did not appear as wrinkled as they had been before. He walked towards her, and then stretched out his hand. Come on, let's get you to bed. For the first time that evening, Alicia smiled.
It's a bit early for that, don't you think?
But Blake did not smile back. For you, and after what happened today, I don't think so. Her smile faded, only a little. She relented and grabbed his hand. Blake could feel her fingers, slightly bony and not very warm. Yet they also had a softness about them, and still seemed to carry a little bit of strength in those little extremities. Blake pulled gently before he led his mother back towards her room. Just as they reached the door, however, Blake panicked. What if that scythe was suddenly back on the floor? Or its case? What if she saw it? A quick glance into her room washed away all those fears. The scythe and the box were still nowhere to be seen. He helped his mother to the bed, but then Alicia removed his hand from her side. She sat down on her own, and then laid herself on her back. Blake turned, noticing a near-empty glass of water, and a pill next to it. He breathed in sharply, but decided not to say anything right now. Instead, he took the water glass, walked into the kitchen, and emptied it in the sink. He refilled the glass with tap water and returned the glass to the nightstand. Please get lots of rest, he said. Okay, Mom? Alicia nodded in response after a few moments of hesitation.
I will, promise.
Blake turned to leave the room.
Honey?
Yeah? He stopped and spun around.
Thank you.
He cracked a smile, but said nothing more. He left his mother's room and looked down the hallway towards the back door. He breathed and waited a few seconds, but felt no strange sensations. Even after a couple more moments, there was still nothing. His mind was so racked that he didn't want to think about anything else right now, and so turned to his own room. He opened the door and closed it most of the way, letting out a sigh of exasperation and lifting his chin high into the air. However, he held back any other emotion he wished to release. He told himself to calm down and take a breath. Blake turned around and faced his bed, freezing suddenly. The scythe lay right on the covers of his bed. He clenched his fists together as his lips tightened. He threw his hands up with a jolt but made no sound. Unbelievable, he thought. But he did not want to deal with this right now. He couldn't. He desperately wanted to, especially now that his mother was home. But Alicia absolutely needed rest and time to recover after what seemed like an unusual day for the both of them. He himself wanted some rest as well, but he dare not touch that thing again. So instead, he simply sat on the floor next to his bed and wrapped his arms around his legs.